Have you ever trusted someone so completely, so instinctively, that the idea of them betraying you felt not just unlikely, but impossible? It's a quiet kind of blindness, the kind that doesn't come from foolishness, but from love, routine, and years of shared life. That was me, Walter Langford. Friends call me Walt. I was 52 when it happened, living in a cedar-framed house in Santa Rosa, California, surrounded by rose bushes I'd planted with my wife, Elaine. We had been married for nearly 20 years. When I went in for spinal surgery, she stayed by my side, or so I thought. 4 days after I returned home, a letter arrived, neatly typed, signed in blue ink. In it, she told me she had left town, that she'd found someone else, that she had already secured her future, and that I too should try. To start fresh, she'd liquidated our investments, sold one of our homes, and transferred the money to accounts I couldn't access. Most men would be shattered. But I didn't panic, because what Elaine didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, was that I'd been preparing for this day long before she packed her bags. Now let me tell you why. I met Elaine in the summer of 1959 at a jazz festival just outside Monterey. She was standing near the edge of the crowd, barefoot on the grass, a red scarf tied loosely in her hair, swaying gently to the rhythm of the saxophone like she had all the time in the world. I was 32, recently out of the Navy and just beginning my civilian career as a mechanical engineer at a firm that designed infrastructure systems. She was 26, magnetic, bold, and already carving out a name for herself in real estate across Northern California. Elaine had that rare kind of charm that didn't need to say much to draw attention. People just seemed to orbit her. Me? I was quiet, measured, the kind of man who carried a pocket notebook even on weekends. And somehow, that contrast between us worked. We married 6 months later and moved into a modest ranch-style house in Santa Rosa, nestled between the vineyards and the coast. Elaine brought color into my life. Cocktail parties, trips to Palm Springs, bright artwork on our walls. I brought order, retirement accounts, a joint savings spreadsheet, insurance policies filed alphabetically. We used to laugh about it. "You plan," she'd say, leaning into my chest, "and I live." It was a good line, a neat summary of our roles. And for a long time it worked. I'd come home to music playing in the kitchen and her voice echoing through the halls, talking on the phone to friends, always planning something. She loved motion, movement, momentum. I, on the other hand, loved certainty, schedules, numbers that lined up. Over time, though, our differences didn't balance. They widened. I noticed it first when she stopped asking about my day, when conversations began to revolve less around we and more around I. She began to talk about things we didn't own yet, places we hadn't been. She mentioned new clients I never met. The sparkle in her eyes that used to light up when I'd show her a new investment plan now flickered, only when she spoke about art showings, design trends, and San Francisco rooftop dinners. Still, I didn't say much. I had my routines, my ledgers, my quiet. I kept records of everything: birth certificates, tax filings, deeds, receipts. Maybe it was the Navy in me, or maybe it was intuition. A voice I chose not to hear at the time. The voice that said, "This house, this woman, this life, it all feels a little more like a performance now." Something curated, not lived. Elaine by then had grown increasingly restless. She began taking on higher-end listings, long lunches with wealthy buyers in the city. She joined a luxury real estate mastermind group and started going to weekend seminars in San Francisco. "It's all part of the business," she said, when I raised an eyebrow at her suitcase in the hallway. Again. "You want me to do well, don't you?" Of course I did, so I said nothing. But I took notes. Not the kind you write on paper, the kind you file away behind the eyes. Our home, once full of shared touches, slowly began to reflect only her taste. Modern art I didn't understand, chrome furniture that looked more like a gallery than a home. I began to realize I was watching someone drift further into a world I hadn't been invited into. But still I hoped. After all, we had built this together. Or so I thought. And so I kept the routines going. The accounts updated, the bills paid, the retirement contributions maxed out. I maintained our life while Elaine curated her next one. What I didn't realize then, but would come to understand all too clearly, was that the woman I had married wasn't planning a future with me. She was planning an exit, and it had already begun. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday afternoon in late March. Elaine had left early that morning for what she described as a networking retreat in San Francisco. I was home early from a canceled site inspection and had planned to surprise her with dinner plans at her favorite seafood place. Instead, I found a printed hotel receipt sticking out of the trash in her home office, a boutique hotel in Sausalito, not San Francisco. A 2-night stay, room service, 2 meals, 1 room. My name wasn't on the reservation. I didn't mention it when she returned. She smiled, kissed my cheek, poured herself a drink, and told me the retreat had gone longer than expected. I simply nodded. From that point on, I started noticing the details. Elaine's perfume changed, subtle but unfamiliar. She had new jewelry, pieces I hadn't gifted her, a sleek silver necklace, a charm bracelet with initials that didn't belong to either of us. There were sudden work dinners that she insisted I not attend because they were client-only. When I offered to drop her off, she declined. When I offered to pick her up, she claimed she'd already arranged a ride. Then came Howard. At first, he was just a name, mentioned once or twice over dinner, always in the context of real estate. A sharp investor, she said, someone who understood her drive. I listened, quietly filing the name away. But soon his presence became more noticeable. A new contact number programmed into our home phone. A red scarf I remembered from that summer jazz festival, the one she wore the first time I saw her, suddenly vanished from her closet. Weeks later, I saw it again, in the passenger seat of a black BMW parked outside a downtown cafe. Howard was behind the wheel. Elaine was beside him. Still, I didn't confront her. I didn't rage or accuse. That was never my nature. Instead, I became what years in military intelligence had trained me to be: observant, patient, quiet. I began building a timeline, logging every unexplained transaction, capturing every bank transfer, every odd withdrawal from our joint accounts. Small amounts at first, 50 here, 75 there. Then came the $2,400 withdrawal labeled property. Expenses, Marin. We didn't own anything in Marin. She began staying out later, coming home with the smell of smoke clinging to her jacket. Not cigarette smoke, but cigars, the kind I knew Howard liked from a country club profile I'd quietly accessed one evening. Her excuses grew thinner. She seemed less concerned with keeping up appearances and more emboldened, as if she believed I had grown too complacent or too old to question anything. What she didn't understand was that I had already begun the process of protecting myself. In early June, I opened a personal file under the name Langford & Sons Holdings, a shell entity I'd quietly registered through a trusted colleague. Transferred the bulk of our savings into business reserves, technically legitimate due to the consulting work I did on the side. Elaine had signed off on all of it over dinner one evening, barely looking at the papers. "Just don't bore me with the details," she had said. I didn't. I also visited a notary that week to update the beneficiaries of our will and retirement portfolios. Without removing her outright, I placed legal contingencies, clauses that would freeze access to shared assets in the event of suspicious withdrawals. It was tedious work, but I moved with calm, deliberate focus. Every account had 2-factor verification. Every paper trail was cross-checked. All the while, Elaine seemed to float through our house like a guest in a hotel suite. Perfectly dressed, endlessly distracted, emotionally absent. I watched her, not with anger, but with increasing certainty. The woman I married had already made her decision. She was simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. What she didn't know was, so was I. The moment came sooner than I expected. In mid-July, I underwent scheduled spinal surgery to correct years of damage from an old service injury. It wasn't a serious operation, but it required a few days in the hospital and several weeks of limited mobility at home. Elaine was attentive during the first few days, checking in with the nurse, making herbal teas I never saw her drink before, fluffing pillows like some picture-perfect caretaker. It almost felt surreal, like she was playing a role. And as I would later learn, she was. On the fourth morning after I returned home, I found a typed letter on my nightstand. It was folded once, centered perfectly on the side table, with no envelope. In her signature clean, confident tone, Elaine wrote that she had left town, that she needed space to rediscover herself, that she was in San Diego now, and that I shouldn't try to find her. The letter wasn't emotional, it was logistical. She had already liquidated our Carmel vacation property and transferred the funds. She had withdrawn over $400,000 from our joint investment accounts and moved them into what she called personal reserves. Her name was now the sole owner on one of our savings plans, documents she claimed I had signed months ago. There was no apology, only a final sentence that read, "I hope you can understand this was the best thing for both of us. You're strong. You'll land on your feet." It was precise, cold, almost rehearsed. But as I sat up slowly, back aching from the incision, I felt none of the panic she must have expected. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and reached for the small black ledger I kept in the drawer of my writing desk. Inside were backup copies of every financial transfer I'd made over the past year. The shell company I created, Langford and Sons Holdings, now contained close to 70% of what had once been our joint assets, and I'd made sure to separate and protect them with corporate legal structures she had never taken the time to understand. Elaine never liked financial discussions. "Just tell me if we're doing okay," she would say. That blind trust in my management, once a gesture of love, was now her greatest mistake. I also opened the wall safe behind my study bookshelf. Inside were copies of our home deed, our marriage certificate, and a signed but unfiled medical power of attorney. I scanned it again and spotted the change. Elaine had filed a version with the county that gave her full control of my medical and financial decisions during recovery. The problem? I never signed that version. The signature was close. Too close. But I've known my own handwriting since boot camp. It was a forgery. By noon, I was on the phone with Maureen Hale, a legal contact from years ago who had once helped me on a small property dispute. I laid it out plainly. She moved the money, she forged my signature, she used my recovery as cover. Maureen didn't ask if I had proof. She asked how much. We scheduled a formal consultation that same week. For the next few days, I remained, still outwardly recovering but inwardly moving like a chess player 2 moves ahead. The nurse continued her shifts unaware. Friends called to check in, and I played the part. Elaine had covered her tracks well enough to fool casual observers, but she'd underestimated the man she left behind. I wasn't the frail husband she imagined, fumbling through papers and painkillers. I was a man who had once tracked radio, silence across war zones, who could recognize patterns before they became disasters. And I had just begun putting the pieces into place. By the end of that week, I had 3 things ready: the original financial documents, the forged power of attorney, and the list of asset transfers under her name. I had one more thing, too: a calm, unwavering determination. Elaine thought she'd slipped away undetected with everything in hand. What she didn't realize was that the storm hadn't passed. It hadn't even started yet. Elaine returned 2 weeks later unannounced, as if she hadn't drained our accounts and vanished without warning. It was early evening. The sun had just started dipping behind the oak trees that lined our backyard when I heard her car in the driveway, the unmistakable hum of her imported convertible, the one I had co-signed for years ago. I sat in the reading room, still moving cautiously from surgery, when the front door opened without a knock. She walked in as if she still lived there, in heels too high for someone trying to feign humility, carrying a leather handbag and a look that tried to mask tension with composure. I didn't get up, I didn't even greet her. I just said, without turning my head, "You're early." She hesitated for a moment, probably expecting a different reception. Outrage, begging, maybe even desperation. What she got was silence. She came into the room, took a seat across from me, crossed her legs and leaned back with calculated ease. "I thought we should talk," she said, her tone rehearsed. "There are things you need to understand. Howard has a different vision. For life. He's opening doors I never thought I could walk through." She talked like she was giving a seminar, full of abstract inspiration and empty conviction. I let her finish. Then, slowly, I reached for the small cassette recorder on the side table and pressed play. Her voice crackled through the speaker, recorded messages she had left weeks earlier, including one where she laughed about how Howard has the whole thing mapped out, and how she signed for Walt's stuff because he never pays attention to details. I paused the tape. Her eyes narrowed. "That's illegal," she said sharply, pointing at the device. "No," I replied, locking eyes with her for the first time. "It's documentation." Elaine shifted, trying to regain footing. "You're blowing this out of proportion." I was upset. "You weren't present for years. This was about survival." I tilted my head. "So forging my signature, emptying our accounts, and selling joint property, those were survival tactics?" She straightened. "You can't prove that I forged anything." "You're right," I said evenly. "I can't. But the county clerk can compare signatures, and the bank has voice confirmation records. They also have that withdrawal you made for the Carmel House sale, which required dual authorization." She stared at me, quiet now, the mask starting to crack. Her voice softened. "Walt, I never meant to hurt you. It was all just momentum. One thing led to another." "No, Elaine," I said, voice calm, precise. "This wasn't momentum, this was planning. You didn't just leave, you staged it. You waited for the one time I couldn't respond, and you acted." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she reached for a glass of water on the table beside her. Her hand trembled slightly. I continued. "You used to say I was too meticulous, that I overplanned everything, and yet somehow, I was the only one who prepared for this." Elaine leaned forward then, trying a different tactic. Her voice dropped to something near a whisper. "Maybe we can find a way to work through this. What we had, it doesn't just disappear. I made mistakes, yes, but so did you. You shut me out." I didn't flinch. "I filed for divorce last week," I said quietly. "The paperwork will be served by Friday, and the bank has already begun investigating the transfers. They've frozen the disputed accounts pending review." She sat back, stunned now. The edge in her posture began to dissolve. "I just came back for a few things," she said finally. "You already took everything that mattered to you," I answered. "But if you're looking for jewelry, the safe's been cleared. If you're looking for the rest of our money, well, that's tied up in accounts you never asked about." There was no dramatic exit. She stood slowly, said nothing, and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she turned back and said, "You think you've won, but this isn't over." I didn't respond. I just watched her go. The door closed behind her with a softness that felt final. For a moment, the house was completely silent. Then I exhaled. Slow, steady, deliberate. It had begun. The next morning, I met with Maureen, Hale in her downtown Santa Rosa office, a no-nonsense space filled with law books, case files, and the faint smell of strong black coffee. She had reviewed the documents I'd sent the week before, the forged power of attorney, the financial transfers, the taped conversation from Elaine's visit. "You were smart," she said, tapping the manila folder with her pen. "Methodical. Most people don't think ahead. You did." She slid a legal pad toward me. "Now let's talk strategy." Maureen outlined two primary options. The first was a quiet divorce with asset division skewed heavily in my favor, backed by evidence of financial misconduct. It would keep things mostly civil and minimize public exposure. The second was a more aggressive path, filing formal fraud charges against Elaine and Howard, potentially triggering a deeper investigation into real estate fraud, forgery, and theft. This route would draw attention, and possibly the interest, of the state's financial crimes unit, but came with more risk, more time, and more fire. I asked one question: do we have enough to prove intent? She didn't blink. Yes, especially if we can trace where the money went. That's where Peter Caro came in, a forensic accountant Maureen had worked with on a previous high-profile embezzlement case. Peter was in his early 40s, polite, but clinically sharp. Within days, he was combing through our financial records, tracing the path of the missing funds. What he uncovered was even more disturbing than I'd expected. Elaine hadn't just moved the money into personal savings. She'd funneled nearly $80,000 into a series of limited partnerships managed by Howard Deeks, the same man she claimed was simply a business consultant. Peter printed out transfer ledgers and wire confirmations. This guy's been running these scams for a while, he told me in a low, deliberate voice. His name came up in 2 past investigations. Never charged, but the patterns are there. He showed me a breakdown. Modest initial deposits followed by larger lump sums, always before major real estate moves. The last transfer, $45,000, had gone through just 2 days after I was discharged from the hospital. Worse still, one of the accounts Elaine used was under the guise of a joint venture, Langford Deeks Holdings, which she created using my last name and forged documentation. That was the legal line crossed. It wasn't just betrayal. It was identity fraud, financial misconduct, and a paper trail so calculated it couldn't be dismissed as emotional impulsivity. She hadn't acted alone, and she hadn't acted without preparation. Maureen met with the DA's office the following week, submitting an official complaint and the initial evidence file. They won't act overnight, she warned me. But if they smell a pattern and Howard has priors, they'll start building a case. And they did. Meanwhile, I filed a formal notice with our primary bank's fraud division. The representative, after reviewing the signature records and voice authorizations, escalated the matter. The bank immediately froze 3 accounts that Elaine had moved money into pending legal review. They also flagged the Carmel property sale as suspicious due to the forged co-authorization. The buyer, unaware of the internal conflict, agreed to cooperate after receiving notice of potential title complications. Elaine's lawyer contacted Maureen a few days later with a thinly veiled threat, accusing me of hiding marital assets and manipulating account access. Maureen laughed when she read the letter. They're grasping, they know they're losing. We responded with a comprehensive affidavit detailing my legal restructuring months in advance, complete with notarized documents, Elaine's signature copies, and updated estate filings. Nothing had been done in secret. It had simply been done with foresight. Privately, I also took steps to ensure my personal safety. I changed every password, installed security cameras around the property, moved sensitive documents to a secure lockbox at my attorney's office. I even reached out to my old Navy buddy, now a private investigator in Oakland, to start looking into Howard's real estate dealings. What we found would later become the linchpin of the entire legal case, but at that point I was still playing defense, making sure every move was deliberate, documented, and lawful. Through it all, I kept a quiet demeanor. No public outbursts. No emotional phone calls, just precision, discipline, strategy. The way I'd always lived, the way she had once admired, until she decided it made me expendable. Elaine had made her play with confidence, but she had misjudged 2 things: the man she'd betrayed, and the fact that the house of cards she built with Howard was about to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. By early September, the consequences of Elaine's choices began, circling back like vultures. The Department of Real Estate had opened a formal inquiry into her license. Her brokerage firm, once proud to showcase her in glossy brochures, suddenly distanced itself, placing her on administrative leave pending internal review. The first domino had fallen, and it wasn't long before others followed. Maureen, ever 3 steps ahead, had already sent anonymized summaries of our evidence to both the State Banking Commission and the Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Unit, tipping them off to the larger pattern surrounding Howard Deeks. We weren't seeking spectacle, we were seeking justice, and now eyes bigger than ours were watching. Meanwhile, Peter Caro, our forensic accountant, uncovered a trail of suspicious real estate deals going back 5 years, 3 of which involved Howard serving as an unofficial advisor to women who, like Elaine, had significant shared assets with passive or recovering spouses. In each case, the pattern was the same: charm, influence, isolation, and strategic liquidation. 2 of those women had already filed civil suits. One of them had lost over $300,000 in marital equity. Another had been manipulated into signing over full property rights while her husband was undergoing chemotherapy. And now, with our documentation in place, we had a third clear example. The pattern was no longer theory. It was evidence. I hadn't spoken to Elaine since the last time she stormed out of the house. All communication went through attorneys now. But the tone of her messages had shifted. The early confidence, the subtle condescension had faded. Now it was confusion, concern, panic. The accounts were frozen. The title to the Carmel property sale was being contested. And worse, for her, Howard had stopped answering her calls. I never celebrated any of it. There was no satisfaction in watching someone drown in a sea they poured themselves. But there was peace in knowing I'd chosen the high road, even while preparing for war. I spent most of those weeks quietly, tending to the roses in the backyard, reviewing financial records and helping Maureen and Peter tighten the case. One day, Peter called with an update that changed everything. We traced the final $45,000 transfer Elaine made, he said. It didn't go to Howard's main business account. It went to a newly opened LLC registered to an address in Reno. Guess who manages it? Howard? I asked. No, Peter replied. Elaine. It was the most damning twist yet. Not only had she funneled money under Howard's guidance, she'd created a new business front of her own, possibly to hide assets in anticipation of our divorce. That meant premeditation, and in the eyes of the court it meant calculated fraud. Maureen filed an emergency motion to secure an injunction against any transfer or withdrawal from the Reno LLC. We got it approved within 48 hours. By then, Howard had officially lawyered up. His attorney, slick and self-important, tried to argue that this was nothing more than a civil disagreement between ex-spouses. But the state had begun to take notice. Investigators from the Financial Crimes Task Force requested access to our filings. It wasn't just about my case anymore. It was about a potential ring of deception hiding behind real estate licenses and romantic manipulation. Behind the scenes, I also did something personal. I wrote a letter, unsigned, to the other 2, women who had previously been scammed by Howard. I didn't reveal who I was. I just offered them copies of our evidence, urging them to consider combining legal efforts. 2 weeks later, one of them contacted Maureen. She'd spoken to the 3rd victim, and together they were ready to press forward, publicly. Elaine, meanwhile, began to unravel. Her texts to my lawyer turned from pleading to threatening. Walt is trying to destroy me, she wrote in one message. This is vengeance, not justice. But Maureen had a firm response. What Walt is doing, she replied in a letter, is cooperating with multiple agencies to ensure no one else falls victim to the same scheme. Still, there was a part of me, buried deep beneath the steadiness, that felt the sting of all. This. Not because I missed Elaine, but because I had once loved her. Because we had once been 2 people building something together. And now here we were. She, entangled in a con. Me, methodically protecting the very life she tried to destroy. But it was no longer about us. It was about accountability. And that was something I was determined to see through, no matter how far it reached. The court date arrived on a crisp October morning. I wore a dark wool suit that hadn't seen sunlight in over a year, and as I stepped into the county courthouse, I felt an eerie calm settle over me. It wasn't pride or anticipation. It was finality. The long months of silence, strategy, and emotional detachment had brought me to this moment. Maureen walked beside me, her briefcase in one hand, posture straight as a steel rod. Today, isn't just about divorce, she reminded me. It's about setting precedent. It's about exposing the kind of manipulation most men never speak about until it's too late. I nodded. She was right. Elaine arrived with Howard at her side. She wore a gray pantsuit, her hair carefully curled, but her expression betrayed fatigue and fear. Howard, for his part, looked more irritated than worried until the judge began speaking. The Honorable Judge Raymond Dillard was a veteran of both the Vietnam War and 30 years on the bench. He didn't tolerate theatrics. "We have a large amount of documentation to review today," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I will not entertain interruptions. If you feel compelled to argue outside legal procedure, you will be removed." The message was clear. No games. Maureen stood first. "Your Honor, this is not merely a case of a failed marriage. It is a case of deliberate deception, financial manipulation, and strategic exploitation. The plaintiff has submitted over 100 pages of documented transfers, forged signatures, and patterns of behavior consistent with prior cases tied to Mr. Deeks." She handed the clerk our full file. In it were bank statements, corporate registration, documents, the audio recording from Elaine's visit, and Peter Caro's forensic financial analysis, each page more damning than the last. Judge Dillard reviewed them silently, page by page, for almost 20 minutes. Then he turned to Howard's attorney, who had barely spoken. "Does your client have a rebuttal to the accusation of operating fraudulent real estate partnerships with vulnerable spouses?" The attorney cleared his throat and muttered something about business misunderstandings. The judge was unimpressed. "I am referring this case to the state attorney's office for a full investigation into Mr. Deeks's business practices, and I will be recommending a temporary freeze on all his accounts pending review." Howard's face paled. Elaine's hands trembled slightly, clutching the edge of the table. She tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, I didn't know." But Judge Dillard held up a hand. "Mrs. Langford, I'm not interested in emotional appeals at this stage. You submitted fraudulent documents. You signed over assets under false pretenses. You participated in the creation of shell entities to conceal marital property." His tone remained calm, but the weight of his words pressed on every corner of the courtroom. "Given the evidence," the judge continued, "I am awarding Mr. Langford full ownership of the primary residence, 85% of all traceable marital assets, and control of any contested business holdings, pending restitution. Mrs. Langford, you will be subject to financial oversight, and a lien will be placed on any future real estate commissions until your restitution payments are fulfilled." Howard leaned back, arms crossed, visibly boiling. Elaine's eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. Not yet. The judge's final statement, though, left no room for delusion. "This court takes special interest in cases where manipulation hides behind affection. And in this case, Mrs. Langford, your actions betrayed both trust and law." As the gavel struck, it felt less like a punishment and more like the release of something that had been building for far too long. Elaine didn't look at me when she left. Howard walked 2 steps ahead of her, already on his phone, likely planning damage control. I remained seated for a while, listening to the quiet return to the room. Maureen finally touched my shoulder. "It's done," she said. Outside, the air was cool and clear. Reporters had begun circling, drawn by the whispers of fraud and scandal. We gave no comment. Instead, I walked down the steps, feeling not triumphant but grounded. Justice hadn't shouted. It hadn't stormed. It had arrived in the form of quiet, structured truth. And that was more powerful than any revenge fantasy I could have imagined. Elaine would face her own consequences. Howard would likely be indicted before year's end. And I would go home to a house no longer haunted by what was taken, but strengthened by what remained. My clarity, my control, and the unshakable peace of having seen it through. In the upper, and this was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming clarity after betrayal and restoring balance when the ground beneath you shifts without warning. I didn't win because I outsmarted anyone. I simply paid attention. I stayed calm. I trusted the truth and let the process do its work. Elaine and Howard made their choices and the law responded. But more importantly, I learned a lesson that I hope reaches anyone watching this now. Trust is a beautiful thing, but it should never be blind. Protecting what you've built doesn't make you cold or paranoid. It makes you wise. Today, my life is quieter. I walk the garden most mornings where the roses still bloom. The silence in my home is no longer a void. It's peace. And I move forward not with bitterness but with clarity. If you've ever experienced a betrayal that changed the course of your life, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Your words might help someone else find their footing in the storm. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We tell stories that speak truth, reveal strength, and remind us that justice, real justice, is never loud, but it always arrives. Comment prompt: have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be nothing like you thought? What did it teach you?